Hey everyone, thank you so much for being here. And tonight's video has three more stories that I keep coming back to. The kind where the most unsettling detail isn't the strange thing that happened, but the ordinary thing that was happening right before it. Make yourself comfortable and let's get into it. I drove commercial trucks for 11 years, and for 3 of those years I took seasonal contracts, hauling freight across ice roads in northern Minnesota and into parts of Canada during the winter months. If you've never driven an ice road, the basic concept is exactly what it sounds like. When the lakes and rivers in certain remote northern regions freeze thick enough to support vehicle weight, temporary roads are established across the ice, connecting communities that are otherwise accessible only by air during the winter. The work pays significantly better than standard trucking specifically because of the risk involved, and the risk is genuinely real. The ice moves, it shifts, it changes thickness across its surface in ways that aren't always predictable. And driving a loaded commercial truck across a frozen lake requires a particular kind of focused attention that most driving doesn't. I want to establish that background because I need you to understand that I was not someone who made mistakes in that work. 3 seasons on ice roads with a clean record meant I had developed a level of situational awareness about that environment that most people who haven't done it simply don't have. I knew what deteriorating ice sounded like under a load. I knew what the instrument cluster was telling me about vehicle weight distribution. I knew how to read the surface ahead for signs of soft spots or pressure ridges. I was careful, methodical, and experienced. What happened on the third season is not something I can attribute to inexperience or inattention. It was February, midway through the season, one of those stretches where you've been doing the work long enough that the initial alertness has settled into professional routine without tipping over into carelessness. I was running a route I had completed multiple times that season, hauling fuel supplies to a remote community about 60 miles across a series of connected frozen lakes and portages. The weather was clear and cold, the kind of cold that makes the air feel thin, temperatures well below zero, the kind of night where the sky is so clear that the stars seem closer than they should be. I was about 40 minutes into the crossing, moving at the recommended speed for the ice conditions that had been logged that morning, headlights reaching out across the flat white surface ahead of me, the darkness on either side where the lake extended beyond my lights, absolute and total. That's one of the things about driving an ice road at night that is genuinely difficult to describe to someone who hasn't done it. The darkness at the edges is different from regular darkness. There's nothing out there. No trees close enough to register. No structure of any kind. Just the ice extending outward until it meets the shoreline somewhere beyond where your lights reach. It creates a sensation of isolation that is unlike anything else I've experienced in over a decade of long-haul trucking. I was passing through the widest section of the main lake, the point where the crossing is furthest from any shoreline in any direction, when my headlights caught something on the ice ahead of me, a person, standing directly on the ice road, maybe 300 feet ahead, facing my direction. My immediate reaction was professional and automatic. I began reducing speed carefully, the kind of controlled deceleration that ice road driving requires. No sudden braking, gradual pressure applied deliberately. As I slowed, I was processing what I was seeing against what was actually possible, because a person standing on an ice road at this location at this hour made essentially no sense. We were at the most remote point of a route that began and ended at staff checkpoints. There were no communities, no structures, no access points anywhere near this section of the crossing. Whatever vehicle this person would have used to get here should have been visible, and nothing was visible beyond the figure itself. I came to a stop with my headlights on the figure from about 150 feet out. I could see it clearly enough to confirm it was a person, standing upright, facing my truck directly. Dark clothing, no visible reflective gear of any kind, which on an active ice road in those conditions represented a serious safety issue, regardless of anything else about the situation. I reached for my radio to call the checkpoint and report a pedestrian on the crossing, keeping my eyes on the figure while I did it. The radio call took maybe 15 seconds. When I looked back through the windshield, there was nothing there. Not moved to the side of the road. Not lying on the ice. Simply not there. The headlights reached the same distance they had before. The ice road surface ahead was flat and empty, and entirely clear. I sat in that truck for a long time before I started moving again. Long enough that the checkpoint called me to ask if I was experiencing a mechanical issue, because my GPS track had shown me stop for several minutes at an unusual location. I told them I thought I'd seen something on the road and had stopped to investigate. They asked if I'd found anything. I said no. They confirmed that no other vehicles were authorized on that section of the crossing that night, and that the route ahead had been checked that morning and logged as clear. I completed the delivery and the return crossing that night without further incident. I filed a report at the checkpoint on my way back through, keeping the description factual and specific. A person visible on the ice road ahead who was not present when I reached the location. The checkpoint supervisor, a man who'd been managing that particular crossing for over a decade, listened to my report without any visible surprise. He told me, after I'd finished, that this section of the lake had a history going back several years. A driver on a previous season had gone missing on that exact crossing. His truck found, stopped on the ice road, at a location consistent with where I'd described seeing the figure. Engine still running, driver gone, with no explanation ever found for how a person exits a truck cab in those conditions and simply disappears. The investigation had been extensive and had produced nothing conclusive. He said other drivers over the seasons since had occasionally reported seeing a figure on the ice at that location, always at the widest point of the lake, always at night, always disappearing before they reached it. I finished that season. I didn't take another ice road contract after it ended. Some environments change on you after something like that, and a frozen lake in absolute darkness was one I found I could no longer approach with the professional detachment the work requires. I still drive commercially, warmer routes now, standard freight, nothing that requires crossing anything frozen. I don't regret leaving that work, but I think about that night sometimes. The absolute clarity of what I saw, 300 feet of straight empty road with a person standing on it, and the identical absolute clarity of what I saw when I look back 15 seconds later. 300 feet of straight empty road with nothing on it at all. I've been hunting white-tailed deer in East Texas since I was old enough to go out with my father, which means I've been doing it for over 30 years at this point. It's not something I feel the need to justify or explain to anyone. It's part of how I grew up, part of how I stay connected to a part of my life that matters to me, and I do it responsibly and legally on private land that I lease annually from a family that's owned the property for generations. The lease covers about 400 acres of mixed pine and hardwood forest, bisected by 2 creek drainages and dotted with food plots I've maintained myself over the years I've been hunting it. I know that property the way you only know a piece of land after spending hundreds of hours on it across different seasons and different conditions. I know where the deer bed during heat, where they move when a cold front pushes through, which creek crossings they prefer at different times of the season. That level of familiarity matters for what I'm about to describe, because it means I was not misreading my environment or mistaking the ordinary for something unusual. I want to start with what happened to my trail cameras, because that's where the whole thing began. I run 12 cameras across the property, positioned at travel corridors, scrapes, and food plot edges, standard setup for serious deer hunting. I check them roughly every 2 weeks during the off-season to monitor deer movement, and every week once the season opens. I'd been running cameras on this property for 6 years before the season I'm describing, and in that time I had developed a clear baseline for what kind of images to expect from each camera location. During early October of that season, I pulled my camera cards for the first time since placing them in September. 11 of the 12 cameras had performed normally, capturing the expected deer movement, some turkey, the occasional coyote or raccoon, everything consistent with what I'd seen from those locations in previous years. The 12th camera, positioned on a travel corridor along the Eastern Creek drainage, had captured something different. The cards showed about 3 weeks of normal activity, deer moving through on schedule, consistent with the other cameras nearby, and then a stretch of about 4 days where the camera had triggered repeatedly at night with no animal in the frame. 37 images across 4 nights, all triggered by the camera's motion sensor, all showing the same empty patch of trail and creek bank with no visible subject. Trail cameras malfunction, leaves blow through the frame, spider webs build up across the lens. Temperature differentials can occasionally trigger a motion sensor without an actual warm-bodied animal being present. I know all of these explanations well, and I've seen all of them produce false triggers over the years. None of them produced 37 false triggers across 4 consecutive nights from a camera that was functioning normally before and after that period. I moved the camera to a different location and noted the situation without drawing any particular conclusions from it. 2 weeks later, coming in before first light to sit a morning stand on the eastern side of the property, I found the ground blind I'd set up near the creek drainage had been disturbed. Not destroyed, not stolen, disturbed. The entrance had been pushed partially open. The chair inside moved from where I'd positioned it. A small folding table I kept inside shifted to a different corner. Something had been inside the blind, and whatever it had moved things deliberately rather than simply blundering through. I checked for animal sign inside and around the blind. No tracks I could conclusively identify in the dry leaves. No hair, no obvious sign that an animal had been responsible. I repositioned the chair, set the table back where I kept it, zipped the entrance, and went to my stand. I didn't hunt well that morning. My attention kept drifting back toward the blind and the creek drainage, which was visible from my stand at about 200 yards, half lit in the early morning gray, before the sun cleared the trees. I sat there watching it, the way you watch something you're not sure you want to see more closely. I started noticing things after that the way you do when your attention has been primed toward a particular area of a property. Small things that individually meant nothing but started adding up into a pattern I couldn't dismiss as easily as I dismissed the camera images or the disturbed blind. A ground scrape appeared along the eastern creek drainage in a location where I'd never seen deer make one in 6 years of hunting that property, positioned in a way that didn't match how deer typically establish scrapes relative to the surrounding terrain and cover. I checked it over several visits and never captured a deer on any nearby camera using it. A tree stand I'd had installed on a permanent post on the eastern side of the property was found one morning with the safety harness attachment point bent in a way that suggested significant downward pressure had been applied to it, as though someone considerably heavier than me had been sitting in it. I weighed 210 pounds at the time. The stand and harness system was rated for 350. The deformation to the attachment point suggested weight significantly above my own. I told my buddy who hunts the property with me on weekends about everything I'd been noticing, laying it out in sequence so he could see the pattern the way I was seeing it. He's a practical, level-headed person, former military, the kind of man who approaches most things empirically and doesn't give much ground to explanations he can't verify. He came out with me the following weekend specifically to look at the eastern section, walking the creek drainage with me and looking at everything I'd described firsthand. He didn't say much while we were out there, just looking carefully at each thing I showed him. On the drive out at the end of the day, he told me he thought someone had been using that section of the property. Not an animal, a person. He said the blind, the tree stand, the scrape location, all of it read to him like someone who knew what deer hunting looked like and was moving through a hunting setup deliberately, either observing it or using it or both. We both knew what that meant in terms of what we should do, which was report it to the landowner and potentially law enforcement if it continued. What neither of us knew was who would be doing this or why, given that the property was gated, posted, and not accessible from any public land. I reported it to the landowner, a man in his 70s named Gerald who'd grown up on that property. He was quiet on the phone for longer than I expected before he told me that this wasn't the first time this had come up in connection with the eastern section along the creek drainage. He said his father had dealt with similar reports from hunters leasing the property decades earlier. Unexplained disturbances to hunting setups, cameras triggering with nothing in the frame, the general feeling among people spending time in that section that they were being watched or followed by something they couldn't identify. He said his father had eventually stopped leasing the eastern section entirely, restricting hunting to the western half of the property, and that Gerald himself had quietly maintained that same restriction with most lessees without explaining why, though I'd apparently set up further east than he'd intended to allow when he approved my camera and stand placements at the start of my lease. I moved all my equipment to the western sections of the property for the remainder of that season and the seasons since. The hunting on the western side has been consistently good, and I've had nothing unusual happen there in the years since. I still lease that property. I've never gone back into the eastern section along the creek drainage, and Gerald has never suggested I should. We don't discuss the eastern section when we talk. The same way you don't discuss certain things with people when both of you have already arrived at an understanding that discussing it won't produce anything useful. Whatever was using that section of forest, I've decided I'd rather not know more about it than I already do. 30 years of hunting has taught me that there are things in the woods that don't resolve cleanly, and that the most practical response is sometimes simply to hunt somewhere else. I worked as a night auditor at a mid-sized hotel in central Tennessee for about 2.5 years during my late 20s. The kind of job that attracts people who either genuinely prefer working through the night or who, like me at that point in my life, simply needed the income differential that overnight positions typically offer and were willing to rearrange their sleep schedule to get it. The work itself wasn't complicated. Night auditing at a hotel involves closing out the day's financial records, running end-of-day reports, handling any late check-ins or early departures, and being available for whatever guest needs arise between roughly 11 at night and 7 in the morning. On slow nights, which was most nights, the work took maybe 3 hours of actual focused attention and left the rest of the shift for reading, studying, or in my case, working on a graduate school application I was slowly putting together during those quiet hours. The hotel had 4 floors and a total of about 120 rooms. At full occupancy, it was busy enough to keep a full staff occupied during the day. During the overnight hours, I was typically alone in the building except for guests, with the nearest manager on call, reachable only by phone for anything beyond routine issues. There was a room on the third floor, 312, that had been flagged in our internal system with a notation I hadn't seen on any other room in the building. A simple text note attached to the room record that said management approval required before booking. No explanation was given in the notation itself, just that restriction and a contact number for the general manager if a guest specifically requested that room. I asked about it during my first month working there, curious enough to bring it up with the front desk supervisor during one of our brief shift overlaps in the early morning. She knew what I was referring to, but was vague about the reason, saying only that the room had some maintenance history that made management cautious about booking it and that it wasn't something the overnight staff needed to concern themselves with. That answer didn't fully satisfy me, but I accepted it and moved on. The room sat empty more often than not, its restriction making it a last resort option that only came into play when the hotel was running close to full occupancy and a manager could be reached to approve it on a case-by-case basis. About 4 months into working there, I had my first experience that I now connect to that room, though I didn't make the connection immediately at the time. I was at the front desk around 2 in the morning, working through the nightly reconciliation reports, when the elevator across the lobby from the desk opened. This wasn't unusual. Guests moved around at all hours, getting ice, retrieving things from their cars, the ordinary movement of people in a building where sleeping schedules vary considerably. What was unusual was that no one stepped out of the elevator. The doors opened, held for their standard interval, and closed again. I looked up from my work when I heard the doors and watched the whole sequence, maybe 8 seconds from open to close, with the elevator car clearly visible and clearly empty. Elevators do this occasionally for mechanical reasons. A button pressed accidentally on a floor, a sensor triggering incorrectly. I noted it mentally and went back to my work. It happened again about 40 minutes later. Same elevator, same result. Empty car, doors open and close, no one present. I checked the floor indicator above the elevator, which showed the car returning to the third floor after the second occurrence. I stood at the desk watching the indicator for a few minutes. It stayed on 3. I went back to my reports and finished the night without further incident. Over the following months, variations of this happened regularly enough that I started logging them in a personal notebook I kept at the desk, not in any official record, just for my own reference. The elevator activating from the third floor with no visible passenger occurred approximately twice a week. Occasionally, I would hear the elevator moving and note it on paper, then check the floor indicator when it stopped, and find it consistently returning to the third floor after each apparently unprompted journey to the lobby. I also began noticing, separately, that the house phone on the wall near the third floor elevator landing, visible on the lobby camera feed I could access from the front desk, occasionally appeared to be off its cradle during the overnight hours. Not consistently, not every night, but often enough that I started checking it specifically during my rounds. I would find it replaced correctly when I physically went up to check, but the camera feed had clearly showed it displaced minutes before. The experience that pushed me past the point of simply logging things and moved me toward actually pursuing an explanation happened about 8 months into my time there. I was doing my standard overnight rounds through the building, a walkthrough of each floor that I did twice per shift to check for any issues requiring attention. When I reached the third floor and found the hallway noticeably colder than the floors above and below it. Hotel hallway temperatures don't vary significantly between floors in a building with a centralized HVAC system. The differential I was feeling wasn't the slight variation you'd get from a guest leaving their room door open or a window crack somewhere. It was a pronounced difference, significant enough that I stood in the elevator lobby for a moment, simply trying to understand what would account for it mechanically. I walked the length of the third floor hallway, checking door seals and listening for any indication of an open window in an occupied room. Everything appeared normal. I reached 312 near the middle of the hallway and paused outside it, partly because I'd noticed from the house log that it was currently unoccupied and partly because the temperature seemed noticeably lower in that section of the hall specifically. I stood outside that door for longer than I needed to for any practical purpose. I wasn't hearing anything from inside, no sound whatsoever. The cold near that door was simply more pronounced than anywhere else on the floor, in a room that had been empty for several days according to the booking system. I went back downstairs, finished my shift, and the next afternoon sent an email to the general manager describing the temperature differential and asking whether there was a known HVAC issue on the third floor that maintenance should address. He called me rather than emailing back, which I noticed. He asked me specifically which section of the third floor I was describing, and when I told him it was most pronounced near 312, he was quiet for a moment before saying he'd have maintenance take a look. I asked him directly during that same call what the management approval requirement on 312 actually meant and whether it was related to what I'd been noticing on overnight shifts. He was quiet for long enough that I thought the call had dropped before he spoke again. He told me that a guest had died in that room several years before my time there, under circumstances that had never been fully explained, and that the room had been flagged in the system following that event, partly for legal reasons, and partly because multiple staff members over the years since had reported experiences in and around that room that the hotel had never been able to attribute to any identifiable mechanical cause. He didn't go into more detail than that, and I didn't press him. The conversation ended shortly after with a reiteration that maintenance would check the HVAC on 3. I worked at that hotel for another year and a half after that conversation. The elevator continued its overnight journeys to the lobby with no visible passenger. The house phone on 3 continued to appear displaced on the camera feed. Room 312 continued to sit empty more often than any other room on the floor, and the hallway outside it continued to run several degrees cooler than the rest of the building during the overnight hours, winter and summer alike, regardless of whatever HVAC adjustments maintenance made in response to my reports. I left that job when I finished my graduate application and got accepted to a program that required relocating. I don't think about it every day, but I think about it more than I'd expect to for a job I left years ago. I think about the simplicity of that room notation in the booking system, management approval required, no explanation attached, and how much history those 3 words turned out to be carrying.